On a quiet winter morning in a small lakeside town, a veteran police officer noticed something that did not belong in the snow. A young German Shepherd puppy sat perfectly still outside a closed bait shop. She did not bark. She did not cry. She did not run. One paw rested on a folded piece of paper, as if letting go would mean losing everything she had left. What was written on that note? And why did she guard it through the cold? This story is not just about rescue. It is about love left behind, and the quiet promises that still keep us alive. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today and leave a comment below. And if stories of hope, kindness, and second chances matter to you, please press subscribe and support our channel. Let the story begin. Where Winter Leaves. Things behind. Winter arrived early in North Haven, Minnesota, the way an old god steps into a room without fanfare and somehow every candle learns to tremble. The town sat along the lake like a small, careful secret. In summer, the marina smelled of sunscreen, minnows, and laughter. In December, it smelled of iron, ice, and the kind of quiet that makes a person listen to their own thoughts whether they want to or not. Snow had been falling since morning. Light flakes at first, then steadier, as if the sky had decided the world needed a fresh sheet pulled over it. The marina road wore that new white like a bandage, softening tire tracks and hiding the sharp little sins of winter. Black ice, cracked curbs, the thin places where the wind polished everything into a lie. North Haven's storefronts were dressed for Christmas. But it was the simpler kind of decoration. Paper wreaths in windows, strings of lights that blinked bravely against the gray, and a plastic Santa outside the bait shop that leaned a little sideways, like he'd been told too many times to keep smiling. Officer Caleb Moran drove the marina stretch in his patrol truck with the slow patience of a man who had outlived too many emergencies and learned which ones were the most dangerous. The quiet ones. Caleb was 61, with the build of someone who had once been broader but had traded muscle for endurance, the way a river trades speed for depth. His shoulders were still square beneath the uniform, but his face had softened into lines that suggested both humor and fatigue. He had close-cropped gray hair that never quite managed to look neatly cut, and eyes the color of cold slate, calm, observant, almost gentle until they weren't. His hands were big and capable, the kind that could lift a stuck car's trunk in a blizzard and also adjust a child's mitten without making the child feel small. 34 years in uniform had taught him this simple truth. Danger didn't always come running and shouting. Sometimes danger came as an absence. No footsteps, no voices, no owner calling a name that should have been called. He'd learned to pay attention to what wasn't there. A thermos sat in the cup holder, coffee cooled to a bitter honesty. His radio murmured the low routine of the day. Farther down the road, the lake was a hard, pewter mirror, the surface locked beneath winter's fist. The docks were frozen into place like ribs, and the boats slept under tarps that sagged with fresh snow, looking like a row of animals trying to huddle. Caleb's tires whispered over the powder. He kept his speed down, not just because of the road, but because he'd grown old enough to respect how quickly a moment could turn. At the edge of the marina, where the shuttered bait shop crouched against the wind, he saw her. A German Shepherd puppy sat beside the building in the shallow lee, where the wall broke the worst of the gusts. Snow dusted her back, but not heavily. That detail landed in Caleb's mind like a small bell. She hadn't been there all night. Likely since morning, abandoned recently enough that the cold hadn't fully claimed her shape. She sat as still as a statue someone had forgotten to move indoors, her posture guarded but not aggressive, the kind of stillness that came from learning that movement sometimes invited pain. Her coat was black and tan, though the tan looked muted under the winter light, like the color had been rinsed by weather. She was around 8 months old by Caleb's best guess, long-legged in the awkward way of a pup not finished becoming herself, ribs faintly suggested under fur that should have been thicker by this time of year. Her ears didn't match. One stood half alert like it remembered its purpose, the other drooped as if it had grown tired of pretending. Her muzzle was narrow, her nose dark and damp, and her eyes, those eyes, were amber brown with a haunted shine, the way a candle looks when it's fighting a draft. She did not bark. She did not whine. She did not run. One front paw rested firmly over a folded piece of paper. Caleb's foot eased off the gas as if the truck itself had felt the gravity of that image. A dog sitting in snow could be a dozen things. Lost, waiting, stubborn. But a dog guarding paper. That was a story. That was a message in a world that rarely bothered sending them. Caleb pulled to the side and cut the engine. The sudden hush felt wrong, like interrupting a prayer mid-syllable. The wind pushed snow across the road in thin, ghostly sheets. From somewhere near the docks, a metal sign squeaked lazily with each gust, like it was complaining but too cold to truly care. Caleb stepped out, boots crunching softly. He kept his hands visible, empty, palms angled down, body turned slightly sideways the way trainers did when they didn't want to look like a threat. That habit wasn't from the academy. That habit was from years of meeting fear in different bodies, humans, animals, sometimes his own. He approached slowly, measuring the distance the way you measure the edge of thin ice. Up close, the pup's breathing was shallow and quick, fogging the air in small, panicked blooms. Her gaze stayed locked on the ground. Not in submission exactly, but in a wary refusal to invite attention to her face. Caleb recognized that too. Some creatures lowered their eyes because they were gentle. Others lowered their eyes because they'd learned it was safer not to be seen. He knelt, ignoring the cold seeping through the fabric at his knee. The snow bit through the uniform like an eager little animal. Caleb didn't curse. He'd sworn in enough winters to know it never made the cold leave. "It's all right," he said softly. His voice carried the gravel of age and the calm of a man who didn't use loudness as proof of authority. "I'm not here to take anything you need." The puppy flinched at the sound, every muscle tightening, shoulders lifting slightly like she expected a blow, but she didn't bolt. Instead, her toes curled harder against the paper, claws scraping faintly on the ice beneath. That tiny scrape was the loudest thing on the road. Caleb swallowed, and something old and familiar settled in his chest. In his years, he had seen men clutching letters like shields, women holding wedding photos as if the image might keep the past from leaving, children refusing to let go of a single toy when everything else had been lost. A note under a paw was the same kind of magic. When you have nothing, you turn what's left into a talisman. Caleb's gaze traveled gently over the puppy, taking inventory without judgment. Her paws looked sore, pads pinker than they should have been, rimmed with tiny cracks. Her whiskers were dusted with frost. There was a faint tremor in her hind legs, as if her body was fighting to keep heat it didn't have. Yet the paw on the paper held steady, stubborn as a promise. Caleb didn't reach for her. He didn't reach for the paper. He just stayed there, close enough to offer warmth by presence, far enough to respect the boundaries she'd drawn in snow. "Hey," he murmured, and it came out like a greeting to someone he already knew. "You been sitting here long?" The pup didn't answer, of course, but her ears shifted, one lifting, one sagging, like she was sorting the sound into safe or dangerous. Caleb let a breath out slowly through his nose, the way you do when you're trying not to startle a deer. "Okay," he said, almost to himself, with a note of dry humor that didn't mock her, just softened the moment. "We're both freezing, so let's make smart choices." The puppy's eyes flicked up for half a second, quick as a match flare, then down again. But Caleb caught it. She was watching, not trusting, but watching. He adjusted his posture slightly, lowering himself more, making his body smaller. The badge on his chest gleamed dully, a little rectangle of authority that meant nothing to a hungry animal and everything to the town. Caleb knew how strange it must look to her. A man in heavy clothing, smelling like leather and old coffee, kneeling in front of a bait shop with Christmas lights blinking behind his head like a halo he didn't deserve. Somewhere inside that shuttered shop, in a warmer world, there were hooks and lures and worms in a mini-fridge, things meant to pull other living things into traps. Caleb wondered if the universe had a sense of humor, leaving a hunted creature outside the place where bait slept. He spoke again, soft and even. "You don't have to do anything fast," he paused. "No one's chasing you right now." That last line wasn't a fact he could prove, but it sounded like something the puppy needed to hear. Her shoulders loosened a fraction, So slight it could have been imagination, but Caleb had built a career on noticing the smallest shifts. The wind picked up, shoving Snow into the shallow corner where she sat. The pup's fur lifted under the gust, and she shivered, harder this time. Caleb's heart clenched, not with panic, but with that steady, practical fear of time. Hypothermia didn't wait for introductions. He glanced at the folded paper again. It wasn't just paper. It was her anchor. If he tried to take it, she might run. And if she ran, she might not survive long out here. Caleb's mind moved the way it always did in difficult moments. Calm, methodical, but threaded with something tender he wouldn't admit to the younger officers. He needed a plan that didn't break her. He reached slowly toward his coat pocket, not toward her, and pulled out a small packet of beef jerky he kept for long shifts. He tore it open quietly. The smell bloomed into the cold air, salty and rich. He placed a small piece on the snow a couple feet away from her, then withdrew his hand and waited. The puppy's nose twitched. She looked at the jerky, then at Caleb's hands, then back to the paper under her paw like she was asking permission from something unseen. Her hunger fought her fear, and fear was winning by a nose. Caleb didn't push. He just sat. The world held its breath. In that long quiet, Caleb noticed other details. The faint tracks in the snow that led toward the bait shop corner. Small paw prints, not fresh enough to be from a minute ago, but not buried either. She'd paced. She'd come and gone in a small radius, but she kept returning to this spot, like the note told her where to wait. Like someone had said, "Stay here, someone will come." Caleb's throat tightened with an anger that had nowhere to go. Not rage, more like grief with teeth. Whoever left her had left her with something. A note. A message. A last instruction. That made it worse and better at the same time, like a wound wrapped in clean cloth. Caleb shifted his weight slightly, careful. "All right," he said. "Here's what we do. You keep your paper. I'll keep you breathing. Fair trade." The puppy's head tilted just a fraction, as if she understood the concept of trade better than kindness. And then, slowly, she moved her paw. Not off the note, but just enough to adjust it, tucking it closer beneath her chest. Protective, possessive, brave in the only way she knew. Caleb's radio crackled once from inside the truck, a distant voice asking about road conditions. Caleb didn't answer. Not yet. This moment mattered more than traffic. He kept his eyes gentle and his movements slow. He could feel the cold beginning to stiffen his fingers. The puppy shivered again, harder. Caleb knew he couldn't wait much longer. But he also knew he couldn't break the one thread holding her in place. So, he did the only thing a seasoned officer with a tired heart and a stubborn sense of decency could do. He stayed. He held still. He let her decide. Snow kept falling, light but relentless, as if the sky was determined to cover every harsh edge in mercy. The marina lights blinked in the distance, tiny stars pinned low to the earth. The bait shop stood silent, its windows dark. And beside its wall, the German Shepherd puppy guarded a folded piece of paper like it was the last spell left in a broken world. Caleb remained kneeling in the snow, close enough to mean help, far enough to mean respect, watching the rise and fall of her breath. He didn't touch her. He didn't take the note. He simply witnessed her, and in that witnessing, a promise began. Quiet as snowfall, stubborn as winter, and just as real. Winter tightened its grip on North Haven by mid-afternoon, the kind of cold that crept rather than attacked, sliding into bones and settling there with quiet confidence. Snow continued to fall in patient layers, softening the town until even time itself seemed padded. Caleb Morin remained kneeling beside the bait shop longer than his knees appreciated, his breath steady, his attention fixed on the small life, guarding a piece of folded paper like it was the last rule holding the world together. Up close, the German Shepherd puppy looked smaller than she had from the road. Fear had a way of shrinking things. Her frame was underfilled, not skeletal, but lean in a way that spoke of missed meals and long waiting. Her fur, thick by nature, lay flatter than it should have, dulled by cold and stress. One ear drooped. the cartilage softened perhaps by frost or earlier neglect, while the other stood half alert, uncertain whether vigilance still mattered. Her eyes remained downcast, but they flicked often, tracking Caleb's hands, his shoulders, the space around him. She was gentle by instinct. He could tell that much, but gentleness learned the hard way often came packaged with vigilance. Caleb shifted slightly, slow enough that the movement read more like weather than intention. His knees protested, a dull ache blooming under the uniform fabric, but he ignored it. At 61, pain was an old companion, predictable, manageable, rarely urgent. What mattered now was the rhythm of the puppy's breathing, still quick, still shallow. Hypothermia didn't announce itself loudly. It persuaded. He glanced again at the folded paper beneath her paw. The edges were damp, the white dulled to a tired gray. It was held together by a rubber band that had lost its elasticity to the cold, stretched and stiff, as if it too had been waiting too long. Caleb understood, then, that the note was not bait or coincidence. It was instruction, maybe even apology. "I'm going to reach for this," he said quietly. Not because the puppy understood English, but because tone mattered more than meaning. "Not you. Just this." He moved one hand, inch by inch, toward the paper, keeping his other hand flat on the snow where she could see it. The puppy stiffened immediately, muscles coiling, a low tremor running through her body. Her paw pressed harder against the folded note, claws scraping ice again in that small, sharp sound that cut straight through Caleb's chest. He stopped. "That's all right," he murmured. "We don't rush." The wind sighed along the building, pushing snow into the narrow corner. The puppy shivered harder, and the tremor broke Caleb's resolve. Waiting too long was not kindness. He adjusted his strategy, not retreating, not advancing, just changing shape. He reached into his coat again and pulled out his spare wool glove, the one he kept for emergencies when his fingers went numb. He placed it on the snow between them, closer to the paper than to himself, then withdrew his hand. The glove lay there, dark and solid, smelling faintly of leather and cold. The puppy stared at it. Caleb waited. After a long moment, she shifted her weight slightly, enough to free the edge of the folded paper from under her paw. The note remained hers, but now it was no longer pinned completely. Caleb took that as permission, not granted, but offered. He slid the paper free slowly, inch by inch, never lifting it out of her sight. The puppy allowed it, though every muscle stayed tight, her eyes tracking the paper as if it might disappear forever if she blinked. When Caleb finally held it, he didn't open it right away. He let it rest in his gloved hand, visible, still part of the shared space between them. Only when the puppy's posture softened by a fraction did he unfold it. The paper was creased deeply, folded and refolded so many times the lines had become permanent. The ink had bled in places where snow or tears, or both, had touched it, but the words were still legible. "She is gentle. Please don't raise your voice. She waits before she moves. Not because she's stubborn, but because she's afraid. She sleeps better if the light stays on." Caleb read it once, then again. Each line landed with a quiet weight. Not dramatic, not pleading, just honest. These were not excuses. They were observations, written by someone who had paid attention. At the bottom of the page, pressed into a dark blur of ink, was a small paw print. Uneven. Imperfect. The kind of mark left by someone who didn't know how else to sign their goodbye. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, the cold forgotten. He had seen plenty of abandonment in his career, animals tied to fences, dropped at shelters, left in boxes like unwanted mail. This was different. This was someone trying, failing, and leaving instructions behind like breadcrumbs of love. He folded the paper again carefully, exactly the way it had been, and held it where the puppy could see it. "We'll keep this safe," he said softly. The puppy leaned forward then, nose brushing the glove that held the note. The contact was brief, tentative, but it was contact nonetheless. Her breath warmed the leather, fogged the air between them. Permission. Caleb exhaled slowly, the way you do when something fragile chooses trust. He reached out, not toward her head, not toward her body, but toward the space beside her, laying the folded note gently on the glove he had placed earlier. He withdrew his hand again. The puppy stared at the note, then at Caleb, then back at the note. After a long second, she shifted closer and placed her paw back on top of it, reclaiming it. But this time, her posture was different, less rigid, less ready to flee. Caleb knew better than to celebrate too early. Trust built like frost, layer by layer, invisible until it wasn't. The cold was no longer negotiable. The puppy's shivering had worsened, her breaths more uneven now. Caleb straightened slowly, joints cracking softly, and stood. He made sure to do it gradually, giving her time to track the movement. "I need to get you somewhere warm," he said. "I won't take this." He nodded at the note. "You keep it." He removed his jacket carefully and draped it over the space beside her, not over her body, creating a small pocket of shelter without touching her directly. The heavy fabric blocked some of the wind, held a bit of heat. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He knocked twice, softly, against the wooden wall of the bait shop. Not loud, not sharp, just two gentle taps. The puppy flinched at the sound, then froze, listening. Nothing followed. No shouting. No footsteps. Just the wind and the snow. Caleb waited. Her head lifted slightly. It wasn't understanding, not yet. But it was noticing. He smiled faintly, the lines around his eyes deepening, and turned toward the truck. Slowly, deliberately, he walked back, opened the passenger door, and retrieved a blanket from behind the seat. He held it up where she could see it, then placed it on the snow a few feet away and stepped back again. The puppy did not move, but she watched. Caleb knelt once more, this time closer to the truck, creating a clear path between warmth and safety. He waited, counting her breaths in his head, matching his pace to hers. He could call for backup. He could radio animal control. Procedure existed for a reason, but something told him this moment didn't need uniforms or extra voices. It needed patience. Minutes passed. Snow collected on Caleb's shoulders, on the brim of his cap. His fingers numbed despite the gloves. Still, he waited. Finally, the puppy shifted forward, dragging the folded note with her, never letting it leave her paw. She stopped at the edge of the blanket, sniffed it cautiously, then stepped onto it, one paw at a time. The warmth wasn't immediate, but it was different enough to matter. Caleb didn't move. She stood there, trembling, wrapped partially in the edge of his jacket, paw still planted firmly on the note. Her eyes lifted at last and met his fully. They were not pleading. They were asking. Caleb answered by knocking twice again, this time on the metal side of the truck. Soft. Controlled. The puppy held his gaze. Then, carefully, she took one more step forward. By the time the puppy reached the edge of the blanket, daylight in North Haven had begun to thin, the gray sky lowering like a ceiling pulled too close. Winter afternoons there were brief, not dramatic in their endings, simply fading, as if the sun had grown tired of trying. The lake beyond the marina turned the color of old steel, and the wind carried a sharper edge now, slicing through gaps in buildings and clothing with professional precision. Caleb Morin stayed exactly where he was. At 61, patience had become less a skill and more a habit etched into his bones. His face, weathered by decades of cold mornings and harder conversations, showed little outward emotion, but his eyes followed every tremble in the puppy's legs, every uncertain shift of her weight. He knew the signs of exhaustion well, even when it wore fur instead of skin. The German Shepherd puppy stood on the blanket, still half sheltered by the edge of Caleb's jacket. She was close enough now that he could see the fine details of her, how the fur around her neck was slightly thicker, trying valiantly to protect her from the cold, how her whiskers trembled with each breath, how her chest moved just a little too fast. Her body told a story of endurance stretched thin. Her age, somewhere between 7 and 9 months, made the sight worse. She was old enough to remember warmth, young enough to still expect it. The folded note remained under her paw, dragged with her like an anchor. It was no longer perfectly folded. The corners were soft, the paper bowed from moisture and repeated handling. Whatever was written inside, it mattered enough to be carried through snow. Caleb knocked twice again, lightly, this time against his own thigh, the sound muffled by fabric. 2 taps, then stillness. He didn't know why he did it. Instinct, maybe. Or the way grief sometimes teaches people rituals they don't remember learning. The puppy didn't retreat. That was enough. Caleb rose slowly, joints protesting quietly, and opened the passenger door of the patrol truck. Warm air spilled out in a visible rush, fogging the air like breath. He turned the heater down immediately, careful not to shock a body that had been cold too long. Experience, both professional and painfully personal, had taught him that too much warmth too fast could be dangerous. He laid the spare blanket across the seat, then stepped back again, giving the puppy space to watch every movement. He didn't reach for her. He didn't speak. He simply waited, one hand resting loosely on the open door, the other relaxed at his side. The puppy watched the truck the way one might watch fire, wary, fascinated, desperate. She sniffed the air, the scent of fabric, old leather, and human warmth drifting toward her. Her ears shifted again, one lifting, one lagging behind, as if even her body couldn't quite agree on what to trust. Caleb crouched slightly and tapped the doorframe twice. 2 knocks. The puppy's gaze flicked from his hand to his face. For the first time, she made a decision that wasn't only about fear. She stepped forward. The movement was awkward, her legs stiff from cold and tension. She hesitated halfway, then continued, climbing into the truck with a soft scramble of claws against metal and fabric. The note never left her paw. Even as she turned in a tight, uncertain circle on the seat, arranging herself as carefully as possible, she kept the paper pinned beneath her like a compass. Caleb closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. He started the engine, then waited another minute before shifting into gear, watching her reflection in the glass. Her breathing began to slow almost immediately, the steady warmth doing what it was meant to do. Her eyes stayed open, alert, tracking every sound, but the panic ebbed just enough to allow fatigue through. As he pulled away from the marina, Caleb allowed himself a long breath. The road back toward town was quiet, the snow swallowing sound. Christmas lights blinked in storefront windows, stubborn and cheerful against the encroaching dark. He drove carefully, one hand light on the wheel, the other resting near the heater controls, adjusting by degrees. At a stop sign near the edge of town, the last of the daylight caught the corner of the folded note beneath the puppy's paw. Where the ink had pooled earlier, darker than the rest, faint letters overlapped, barely visible now that the paper was drying. M.A.R. Caleb leaned slightly, squinting without startling her. The letters weren't written clearly. They looked more like the ghost of a word than a declaration, as if someone had started to write and stopped, afraid of finishing. He tried it softly, letting the sound barely disturb the air. Marrow. The puppy's eyes lifted. Not startled, not frightened. Aware. Her head tilted, and her tail, thin, underfed, but unmistakably alive, moved once against the blanket. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. Something he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the moment he cut the engine by the bait shop. He didn't smile broadly. He didn't reach out. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something that had already been true. "All right then," he murmured. "Marrow." The veterinary clinic sat a few blocks from the town center, a low building with warm lights glowing in the windows and a wreath taped crookedly to the front door. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and pine cleaner, a strangely comforting combination. The bell over the door chimed softly as Caleb entered, the cold following him in like an uninvited guest. The receptionist looked up immediately. She was a woman in her early 40s, medium height, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot. Her expression shifting from routine politeness to concern the moment she saw the blanket-wrapped shape in Caleb's arms. Her name tag read, Lisa, letters worn smooth. "What have you got?" she asked gently. "Found her at the marina," Caleb replied, keeping his voice low. "Cold, dehydrated, young." Lisa nodded once, already moving. "Room 2's open." The veterinarian on duty, Dr. Ellen Park, was in her late 50s, slim, with silver threading through her dark hair and hands that moved with quiet confidence. Years in practice had given her a calm that bordered on reverence when it came to fragile lives. She approached slowly, crouching to the puppy's level without reaching for her. Marrow stiffened but did not growl. "That's a good sign," Dr. Park said quietly. "Let's take this slow." They worked carefully. No rushing. No raised voices. Marrow was weighed, examined, her temperature taken with minimal restraint. Caleb stayed nearby, a steady presence, speaking softly whenever her breathing spiked. Diagnosis came in pieces, delivered without drama. Early hypothermia, dehydration, underfeeding, mild frostbite on the tips of her ears and pads, enough to hurt, not enough to permanently damage. No fractures, no internal bleeding. Dr. Park exhaled slowly, relief threading her voice. Another night out there would have been too much. Caleb nodded. He didn't need to imagine it. They settled Marrow into a kennel under soft, steady lights. Caleb placed the folded note inside, taping it gently to the wall at eye level so she could see it. Her gaze followed his hands, tension easing only when the paper was secure. She lay down slowly, curling around herself. Exhaustion finally claiming its due. Her breathing evened out, deepened. The clinic hummed quietly around her. Machines, distant voices, the low reassurance of a place built to mend. Caleb remained standing there longer than necessary, hands resting on the edge of the kennel, eyes on the small rise and fall of her chest. Outside, snow continued to fall. Inside, Marrow slept. Night settled over North Haven with the quiet authority of something ancient and unquestioned. Christmas Eve arrived without bells or spectacle, only a deeper cold and a sky the color of ash, as if winter itself were holding vigil. Snow pressed softly against the windows of the veterinary clinic, collecting on the sills in delicate ridges that looked almost intentional, as though someone were marking time outside. Inside, the clinic was dimmed for the evening. Overhead lights were lowered, leaving only the steady glow above the kennels and the soft green indicators of monitoring equipment. The building hummed with restrained life. Machines breathing for those who could not yet do so well on their own. Heaters clicking faintly as they fought the cold, and the occasional muted footstep of a technician moving with practiced care. Marrow lay curled in her kennel, her body tucked tight, conserving warmth even now that it surrounded her. The blanket Caleb had brought was folded beneath her chest, her chin resting on the edge like a child clutching a familiar pillow. Her ears were still mismatched, one folded low, the other lifting slightly whenever a new sound drifted through the room. The mild frostbite on her ear tips had darkened just enough to be noticeable, a reminder of how close winter had come to keeping her. The folded note was taped carefully to the kennel wall at eye level. Caleb had insisted on that detail before leaving the exam room, his voice calm but unyielding in the way it became when he knew something mattered. Now the paper rested there, protected in a clear sleeve, the words faint but readable, the small paw print still visible at the bottom like a quiet oath. Marrow's eyes opened and closed in restless intervals. She was not fully asleep, not fully awake, hovering in that uneasy space where the body rests but the mind keeps watch. Her breathing, though steadier than before, still carried a slight hitch at the end of each inhale, a subtle reminder of how hard her lungs were working. Caleb sat on a metal chair beside the kennel, his coat folded neatly over his arm. He hadn't planned on staying. He had paperwork to file, a small house waiting for him by the frozen lake, and a Christmas Eve routine that involved reheated soup and a radio tuned to a station that played old hymns after dark. But when Dr. Park mentioned the risk of respiratory distress, something in Caleb had anchored itself to that chair and refused to move. He leaned forward slightly now, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. His face looked older in the low light, lines deepened by shadow, but there was a steadiness there that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with choice. He watched Marrow the way one watches a fire that has nearly gone out. Not with panic, but with attention. A veterinary nurse named Hannah moved quietly down the row of kennels, checking monitors and adjusting IV lines. She was in her late 20s, tall and narrow-showered, with soft brown hair pulled into a braid that slipped loose whenever she forgot to retie it. Her manner with animals was gentle but efficient, shaped by years of late nights and early losses. When she reached Marrow's kennel, she paused, noticing the note taped to the wall. "That's new," she said softly. "Not quite a question." Caleb nodded. "It helps her stay." Hannah studied the puppy for a moment, then the note. "Whatever works," she said, and meant it. She adjusted a setting on the monitor and moved on, her footsteps fading back into the quiet. Marrow shifted then, a low whine barely audible escaping her throat. Her breathing quickened, chest fluttering under fur that still hadn't fully fluffed back into itself. Caleb straightened immediately, alert. He had heard that sound before, in men pulled from icy water, in children with asthma when the air turned sharp. It was the sound of a body asking for help without knowing the words. Dr. Park returned within minutes, her presence calm but purposeful. She checked Marrow's gums, listened to her lungs, and frowned slightly. "She's working too hard," the vet said. "I don't want to wait." They moved Marrow gently into an oxygen enclosure, a clear chamber that hummed softly as it filled with warm, enriched air. The transition unsettled her. Her body tensed, paws scraping lightly against the smooth surface as she tried to orient herself. Her eyes searched frantically until they found the note again, now retaped inside the enclosure where she could see it clearly. Still, her breathing remained rapid. Caleb stood close, one hand resting lightly against the side of the enclosure. He didn't touch her, not yet. He remembered the words on the note, "Please don't raise your voice." So he didn't. Instead, he lifted his knuckles and tapped gently against the plastic. Tap, tap. The sound was soft, controlled, barely louder than the hum of the oxygen. Marrow froze, her eyes locked onto his hand. Her breathing stuttered, then slowed, just slightly, like a tide pausing before retreating. Caleb waited a beat, then tapped again. Tap, tap. Nothing bad followed, no restraint, no pain. Just the same quiet room, the same steady presence. Marrow's chest rose and fell again, slower this time. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He hadn't known why he'd knocked the first time, back by the bait shop. Now he understood. It wasn't a command. It wasn't reassurance exactly. It was a signal. He stayed there as the hours crept forward, the clinic clock ticking softly on the wall. Midnight passed without ceremony. Somewhere in town, church bells rang briefly, thin and distant, swallowed quickly by snow. Christmas arrived unnoticed by most of the world inside that room. Marrow's condition wavered through the night. Sometimes her breathing deepened, her body relaxing into the warmth of the enclosure. Other times, her chest tightened again, her paws pressing against the floor as if she needed to brace herself against the air. Each time it happened, Caleb was there. 2 taps. Wait. 2 taps. Sometimes she responded immediately, her gaze softening, her breath slowing. Sometimes she only watched him, eyes wide, fear flickering but not overtaking her. And sometimes she shook, her body remembering the cold too well. Caleb never rushed her. He knocked only when she needed it. By early morning, the snow outside had thickened, flakes falling faster now, piling against the clinic walls as if winter were trying to reclaim what it had nearly taken. Inside, the oxygen enclosure glowed faintly, a small island of warmth in a white world. Marrow lay still, exhaustion finally winning over vigilance. Her breathing was not perfect, but it was steadier, her body no longer fighting every inhale. The note remained taped beside her, unmoved, its presence as constant as Caleb's. He sat back in the chair, spine protesting quietly, and allowed his eyes to close for the first time all night. He did not sleep. He simply rested in the same way Marrow did, half aware, listening. When his eyes opened again, dawn was beginning to thin the dark. The sky lightened from black to gray, and the storm outside eased into a gentler fall. Hannah returned, bringing 2 cups of coffee, one of which she placed silently beside Caleb. "She's holding," the nurse said quietly. Caleb nodded, his fingers curling around the warm cup. "Good." Marrow stirred then, her eyes opening. She looked at the note, then at Caleb. Her gaze lingered, searching. He raised his hand. Tap, tap. Her breathing slowed. Outside, the world prepared itself for Christmas morning. Inside, something far quieter happened. Marrow chose to stay. Morning arrived in North Haven without ceremony, pale light seeping through the clinic windows as if the day itself were unsure it was welcome. Snow still covered everything outside, but it had stopped falling sometime before dawn, leaving the world hushed and waiting. The kind of quiet that followed survival always felt different from the quiet that preceded it. One was empty. The other was full. Inside the veterinary clinic, warmth hummed steadily. Machines blinked. Oxygen levels adjusted themselves in patient increments, and the faint smell of antiseptic mixed with pine cleaner and stale coffee. Christmas morning existed out there somewhere, in kitchens, in churches, in living rooms. But here, time was measured in breaths. Marrow lay inside the oxygen enclosure. Her body stretched slightly longer than it had been the night before. She no longer curled inward so tightly, no longer folded herself into the smallest possible shape. Her breathing, while not perfect, had found a rhythm that did not fight itself. Each inhale filled her chest. Each exhale left it again without panic. The note remained taped to the inside wall, sealed in its clear sleeve. The paper had dried completely now, the ink settled into permanent shapes. The words no longer bled into one another. They simply were. Caleb Morin sat in the same chair he had occupied all night, his coat draped over the back, his posture less rigid now, but no less attentive. He looked older in the daylight, the lines in his face drawn deeper by fatigue, his shoulders slightly slumped from hours spent listening instead of moving. But there was something else there too, something steadier. He had not slept, not truly, but he had stayed. And staying, he had learned, changed things. Dr. Park entered quietly, her footsteps careful, her expression reserved in the way doctors saved for moments that could still tilt either direction. She checked the monitor, listened to Marrow's lungs, and nodded once. "She can come out of oxygen," she said softly. Slowly. They opened the enclosure with care, letting the enriched air thin gradually. Marrow stirred as the environment changed, her ears twitching, her nose lifting to test the difference. She did not panic. She did not scramble. Caleb tapped twice on the plastic before the door fully opened. Tap. Tap. Marrow's eyes found his hand. Her breathing slowed another fraction, as if her body recognized the signal before her mind did. They moved her gently into a standard kennel, lined with blankets warmed in the clinic dryer. The transition unsettled her briefly. New space, new air, but she adjusted, settling onto her side with a tired huff. The frostbite on her ears had softened in color, no longer darkening, no longer threatening. Her paws, still tender, were wrapped lightly in protective balm and gauze. "She's weak," Dr. Park said, "but she's past the worst of it." Caleb nodded. He did not thank her. Gratitude felt too small for what had been given. They offered Marrow food later that morning. A shallow bowl, warm, carefully portioned. She sniffed it, turned her head away, then glanced up. Not at the bowl, but at the note. When a technician accidentally brushed the paper sleeve while adjusting the kennel door and turned it slightly, Marrow froze. Her body went rigid. Her breathing hitched. Caleb noticed immediately. He moved closer, careful not to crowd her, and reached out to turn the note back to its original position so she could see it clearly. As the paper shifted, something faint appeared on the backside. Ink so light it had been invisible before, revealed only now that the paper was fully dry. 2 knocks means safe. The words were written unevenly, smaller than the rest, tucked into the corner as if added at the last moment. A private instruction, a final kindness. Caleb stared at the line for a long second, understanding blooming slowly in his chest. He lifted his knuckles and knocked twice on the kennel frame. Tap, tap. Marrow stared. Then, hesitantly, she lifted one paw and tapped the floor once. She paused. Tapped again. It wasn't perfect. The timing was off. The sound barely audible, but it was there. Caleb felt his throat tighten. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a conversation finally spoken aloud. From then on, everything became slower, deliberate. When a nurse approached, Caleb tapped twice first, When the kennel door opened, 2 taps came before the latch. When Marrow startled at a sound, Caleb waited until her breathing spiked, then tapped. Never before, never after. Only when she needed it. It didn't work every time. Sometimes she just watched, frozen, her body remembering other meanings for noise. Sometimes she shook despite the signal, fear echoing louder than logic. But gradually, something shifted. Her eyes softened sooner. Her breaths came easier. By the 3rd day, she stood. It happened without announcement. No one was touching her. No encouragement. Just a quiet moment when her legs, still thin and uncertain, decided they could hold her again. She rose slowly, wobbling slightly, then steadied. The room stilled. Caleb did not move. Marrow looked around the kennel, then reached down and picked up the laminated note gently in her mouth. She did not chew it. She did not bend it. She held it the way one holds something breakable, something irreplaceable. She turned, moving carefully, and walked, slow, trembling, toward the front of the kennel where Caleb stood. Every step cost her something. Strength, courage, balance. She reached the bars and stopped. Caleb opened the door just enough to create space, then stepped back. He did not reach for her. He did not speak. Marrow lifted her head and placed the note into his open hand, not dropping it, returning it. Caleb closed his fingers around the edges gently, as if accepting custody of something sacred. He lowered himself slightly, bringing himself to her level, and knocked twice on the floor. Tap, tap. Then he stepped back. Marrow hesitated. She looked toward the hallway where light spilled across the linoleum. She looked back at Caleb, then at his now empty hand. Her ears shifted. Her chest rose and fell. And then she stepped forward. One step, then another. Her body moved carefully, but her gaze stayed lifted. She did not need to keep the paper under her paw anymore. She had learned where safety lived. Caleb watched her cross the threshold, his chest aching in a way that felt almost like relief. He understood then that this moment, this release, was the real rescue. Not pulling her from the cold, not warming her body, letting her choose forward. Outside, the sun finally broke through the cloud cover, light catching on the snow and turning it briefly, brilliantly white. Inside, Marrow stood in that light, unburdened. The days that followed did not rush Marrow, and North Haven did not rush them either. Winter held the town in a patient grip, the lake frozen solid now, its surface etched with pale lines where ice had expanded and contracted through the night. Snowbanks grew taller along the streets, shaped by plows into long white shoulders that caught the light and threw it back, bright and clean. Christmas moved through town in small ways. Paper stars taped to windows, hymn music drifting from radios, neighbors leaving thermoses on porches for the mail carrier. But the loud parts of the season stayed mostly elsewhere. Here, things happened slowly, the way healing preferred. By law, Marrow could not leave the clinic right away. There were forms to file, holds to observe, and protocols designed to protect animals whose stories arrived without witnesses. Caleb Morin understood procedure. He respected it. He had spent most of his life living inside its margins. Still, the waiting asked something of him he had not expected. Restraint without distance. He visited every day, sometimes twice, sometimes just long enough to knock twice on the kennel door and sit until Marrow's breathing settled into its steady rhythm. Tap, tap, safe. The words did not need to be said aloud anymore. They existed in the space between them, practiced and quiet. Marrow grew stronger by increments. She ate more, though never hurriedly, always checking the room before lowering her head to the bowl. Her coat began to lift again, the black deepening, the tan warming under the clinic lights. The frostbitten edges of her ears healed into pale scars that would always mark Winter's claim, but they no longer hurt. Her paws toughened gradually, skin mending into something reliable. She learned the schedule of the place, the sound of Hannah's footsteps, the way Dr. Park hummed without realizing it when she reviewed charts. She learned that doors opened and closed without trapping her, that hands could approach and then stop, that not every sound meant danger. Caleb learned, too. He learned that his presence mattered most when it was consistent rather than constant. He learned that sitting in silence could be a kind of promise. He learned that hope did not need to be loud to be real. On the day the legal hold ended, Dr. Park handed him a clipboard with a familiar look, professional calm edged with something warmer. "You're cleared," she said, "if you still want to proceed." Caleb took the clipboard with both hands, reading every line even though he already knew what it would say. Adoption paperwork was a strange thing. So much ink for something that felt already decided. He signed carefully, his handwriting steady, his name anchoring the page like a quiet vow. When he returned to Marrow's kennel, he did not say anything. He lifted his knuckles and knocked twice. Tap, tap. She rose immediately, tail moving once, then again, stronger now. She did not reach for the note, no longer taped to the wall, but looked to Caleb instead. That was new. That mattered. The drive home was different from the first. Marrow climbed into the truck without hesitation, turning in a small circle before settling on the seat, eyes forward. The heater hummed low. Snow drifted lazily across the road. Caleb drove with the windows cracked just enough to let in winter's clean edge, the kind that reminded a person they were alive. He talked to her then, not because she needed instruction, but because the road invited it. He told her about the lake, about the way it looked at sunrise, about the house he'd bought years ago thinking he'd fill it with guests and had instead filled with quiet. He told her about the old dock behind it, half buried now, and the trees that creaked in the wind like they were speaking a language only winter understood. The house sat back from the road, modest and sturdy, its roof heavy with snow. A single window faced the lake, glass frosted at the edges, sunlight catching in the center. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood and soap, the warmth even and gentle. Caleb moved carefully, aware of how thresholds could feel like traps to a body that remembered cold. He let Marrow set the pace. She paused in the doorway, sniffed, stepped forward, paused again, then crossed fully into the room. He knocked twice on the doorframe behind her. Tap, tap, safe. He had prepared the space without knowing exactly how. A bed by the window, low and wide. Bowls placed with intention, not tucked into corners. Lights that could be left on without glare. And on the wall near the window, low enough to be seen from the floor, he hung a frame. Inside it, the note rested, protected by glass, the ink steady now, the paw print clear. It did not dominate the room. It did not ask to be remembered loudly. It simply existed where it could be found when needed. The first night passed quietly. Marrow slept in pieces, lifting her head at unfamiliar sounds, checking the window, the door, the frame. Each time, Caleb knocked twice on the arm of his chair or the edge of the table. Tap, tap, safe. The ritual held. Morning came pale and cold, light sliding across the frozen lake and spilling into the room. Marrow stood beneath the window, nose lifted to the glass, breath fogging it briefly. She did not touch the frame. She did not need to. Days arranged themselves into a new shape. Walks came slow at first, paws careful on packed snow, confidence building with each return home. Neighbors waved, asked gentle questions, accepted short answers. Caleb did not explain everything. Some stories worked better when they stayed whole. Marrow learned the sound of the kettle, the rhythm of the house, the way Caleb's steps changed when he was tired or thinking too hard. She learned that doors opened outward, that the lake did not swallow the shore, that winter could be watched safely from inside. Sometimes fear still visited. A sudden bang. A raised voice from the radio. On those days, Marrow went to the window and stood beneath the frame. Caleb followed with the same steady calm he'd practiced since the marina. 2 knocks. The world stayed intact. The fear loosened its grip. Spring would come eventually. Caleb knew that. The ice would break, the docks would creak back into usefulness, and the town would smell like water and pine again. But winter had given him something first. Something earned. Marrow lay in the sun each morning now, name tag chiming softly when she shifted, eyes half closed, body relaxed in a way it had never been by the bait shop wall. She did not guard paper anymore. She guarded nothing. There was no need. Some things, Caleb had learned, did not have to be held tightly to be kept. They only needed a place to rest, a frame by a window, and a promise that had already been kept. This story reminds us that miracles rarely arrive with thunder. Most of the time, God works quietly, through patience, through kindness, through someone who chooses to stay when leaving would be easier. Mero survived not only because she was rescued from the cold, but because someone listened to the language of her fear. Someone respected the instructions written by love. In our daily lives, we are often surrounded by people carrying invisible notes, unspoken pain, silent prayers, hidden wounds. God asks us not to rush them, not to judge them, but to offer steady presence and gentle faith. The Bible tells us that God is close to the brokenhearted, and this story shows us that sometimes He sends His comfort through ordinary hands. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. And if you believe in quiet miracles and second chances, please subscribe and support our channel so we can continue sharing stories like this. May God bless you and your family. May He protect you in every season of your life. And if you believe in His love and grace, please type Amen in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing. And thank you for supporting our YouTube channel.